let me tell you a little bit about Bill before we begin. Bill Hayes is the author of How We Live Now, Insomniac City, and The Anatomist, among other books. Hayes is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in nonfiction and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times. A collection of his street photography, How New York Breaks Your Heart, was published recently by Bloomsbury. Bill has completed the screenplay for a film adaptation of Insomniac City, currently in the works, and he is also the co-editor of Oliver Sacks' posthumous books. He lives in New York City, and we are so pleased to have him join us today. So with that, let me just pose a question to help all our viewers who have not had a chance to read this book get a little information. And could you tell us a little bit for the people who haven't had a chance to read the whole thing?
Sure. Sweat is traces the history of exercise over 2 millennia, from antiquity up through the present day. It's primarily in the Western world, but not only. There are a range of historical figures in the book, from Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, Galen in antiquity, through the Middle Ages, 19th century, and up to the present day. Jane Fonda, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jack LaLanne. But the primary historical figure is someone we'll talk about, I'm sure, a physician named Girolamo Mercuriality from the 16th century. And Sweat is also a kind of chronicle of my own history of exercise. So there's also a kind of personal narrative that runs through the book.
Great. It is chock full of history. It's really quite a piece of work. Let's see, where did you get the initial idea for the book, and what sparked your interest in exercise?
Well, I have been interested in exercise and working out since I was a kid. I was the only son in a large family growing up in Spokane, Washington. My dad was a West Point graduate, quite an athlete. And as his only son, I was sort of trained in different sports and exercises. And the idea for this book came about 10 years ago. I was in a gym, aptly enough, and climbed atop a Stairmaster, my cardio machine of choice, kind of an old school cardio machine. And I still remember to this day punching in my program, fat burner, 25 minutes, level 8 or 10 or something, put down my water and my towel. And for some reason on that day, I paused and I looked out at the gym floor before me, all these people, men and women, lifting weights, doing pull-ups, chin-ups, sit-ups, Bozu ball, yoga. And I just stopped and thought, how did we all end up here in gyms? And if I were to trace a line backward in time, where would I land? Where would I start? And I literally picked up my towel and water, got off the Stairmaster, and went to the library, thinking that I would find a book that answered my question, a book on the history of exercise. And I didn't. And I think a kind of light bulb went on or off, whatever the phrase is, because I thought, well, that's odd. I didn't find a kind of comprehensive book that would answer that question. But it took me a few years before I really got the idea together and began doing serious research. And so this book has really been something I've been working on and off, kind of more off than on, but on and off for about 10 years. And it's great to have it finally come out. But yeah, it all started in a gym.
In a gym. Well,
Yeah.
you have certainly done your research. Let's see. What surprised you most about your research into the ancients?
Let's see. What surprised me most?
Or maybe you want to tell people a little bit about what you found out in Rome and Greece, in Greek.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things that surprised me. One was that there were gymnasiums in almost every town in antiquity, in the ancient Greek Empire, that this was a culture not just of athletics, epitomized by the Olympic Games and athletic competitions, but that gymnasiums were a central part of most towns in the Greek Empire. I should say right away that gyms were open only to men and boys, not to women and girls. But this was very much a part of that culture. I think surprised too that when I began digging into the writings and thinking of philosophers and physicians like Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, Galen in the 2nd century, that their advice about exercise was so sensible, intuitive, because they didn't really understand the workings of the human body like we do today. But the exercise advice they were dispensing and advocating was actually quite sensible. It was Hippocrates who said, eating alone will not keep a man well. He must also take exercise. For food and exercise, while possessing opposite qualities, yet work together to produce health. And keep in mind, this is the 5th century BC. Hippocrates wrote 2 treatises on exercise, diet, nutrition, health. So he was really the first to articulate the tenets of exercise as we know it today. Another thing that really surprised me, some people find this a little gross, but I think it's fascinating. And it kind of plays into the title of my book. In antiquity, the sweat of athletes in particular was considered a prized commodity. They believed that the sweat of supreme athletes, competitive athletes, must contain the essence of arete, the word for like excellence. And they actually created a special tool to scrape the sweat and oil off the bodies, off their own bodies, off the bodies of athletes, whether after competition or exercising in the gyms. It was called a strigil, and it was shaped sort of like a celery stalk. And you can see examples at the Met Museum here in New York, or major museums around the world. And they would funnel the sweat and oil from the body into little clay pots. This fluid, which must have been very funky smelling, to say the least, was actually sold for high prices in gymnasiums, and it sort of aided the gyms in their finances. And it was believed, again, that this was a kind of precious commodity, that it had medicinal purposes, and that it could be used as a curative. But I think what is also surprising is that Gloyos was not sold to, like a supplement might be today, to make you lift more or run faster or be a better athlete, but for very common dermatological problems, to put it diplomatically. So things like warts and hemorrhoids, they would use Gloyos as a purported cure.
I'm glad that's off the market. You speak a lot about Mercuriality and his importance to the early days of exercise. Could you tell the audience a bit about him?
Yeah, as I said, there are many historical figures in my book, from Hippocrates to Jane Fonda. But the main figure is Girolamo Mercuriali. Mercuriali, unknown to most of us, certainly was unknown to me before I started doing my research. He was a 16th century physician, personal physician to a cardinal in Rome, a very prominent, prosperous cardinal named Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And while he was physician to Cardinal Farnese, he had access to the Vatican Library and to the Farnese family library. And he began digging into these ancient texts by Hippocrates and Aristotle and others, Galen in particular, that I've mentioned. He was able to translate and decipher and read these texts. And Mercuriali wrote what is considered the first comprehensive, as well as illustrated, book on exercise. It's called De Arte Gymnastica. It was first published in 1569, went through several editions in his lifetime. Now, if anyone out there has never heard of them, you're not alone. When I started my research, I was allowed to go to a really beautiful library here in New York City at the New York Academy of Medicine in the rare books room. And I had reserved books by Hippocrates and Galen and a few others. And the librarian looked at me very kindly and said, "Surely you've heard of Girolamo Mercuriale." And I said, no, I've never heard of him. And she said, "Wait here a moment." And she went back into storage, came back wearing white gloves and holding a pristine first edition of De Arte Gymnastica, as I said, from 1569. And I put on a pair of white gloves and I opened it, and I happened to open the book to one of the 12 or 13 woodcut engravings in the book. And it was an illustration of two pairs of naked men wrestling, like ancient or Olympic wrestlers. It was such a bold, vivid, captivating illustration. Something just caught my eye, and I thought, I've got to know more about this book. And I turned the page and found that the entire book was written in medieval Latin. So I couldn't read a word of it. It was a big tome, though I could make out the word exercise in Latin. So from there, I tracked down an English translation. I read the whole book. I ended up tracking down the English translator in London, and it kind of set me off on a journey to retrace Mercuriality's life, what led him to write this book, and his life story, which is kind of woven into my book, Sweat. What's fascinating about De Arte Gymnastica is that he devotes chapters to every form of exercise known at that time: walking, running, swimming, wrestling, boxing, always from the position of a physician, looking at the pros and cons, if it's going to benefit your health or not. And a lot of his advice or thinking about exercise was quite sensible. And so I became very fascinated by Mercuriale and De Arte Gymnastica.
Yeah, what a lot of info on him. Well, I had a question about the ancient forms of exercise, but it pretty much sounds like they did almost everything.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the ancients as well as Mercuriale, only, there were certain forms of exercise that, quote unquote, had not been invented. Yes. So a good example is the bicycle. So there's nothing about bicycling in Mercuriality's book. In the West, they didn't know about yoga, so there's nothing about yoga. In antiquity, it was the kinds of things you would see in athletic competitions like the Olympics. So running, boxing, wrestling. There was a sport called pancration, which was sort of like mixed martial arts, very violent kind of mixed martial arts. But also walking. I mean, in the gymnasiums in ancient Greece, there were porticos designed specifically for walking, and it was considered an excellent form of exercise, but one where you could also walk with your companion or friend or teacher or mentor and talk. And so there was philosophizing going on there as well. One of my favorite little tidbits that I discovered was about Plato. And Plato was a great advocate of exercise, in part because Plato himself had been a competitive wrestler in athletic games at one of the 4 athletic festivals. Olympia, or the Olympics, is the best known, of course. The Olympics are going on right now. But there were 3 others, which explains why the Olympics were every 4 years. So there were major athletic competitions at Isthmia, Nemea, Delphi, and Olympia. And Plato competed as a wrestler at Isthmia. And his given name was Aristocles, but his wrestling coach nicknamed him Plato from the Greek word for broad-shouldered, which I think is Platon. And it's sort of an abbreviation or nickname for broad-shouldered, and that's where the name Plato comes from.
It's stuck.
Yeah, it's stuck.
You spoke briefly about women, but did they really play any role at all in exercise in the ancient days?
Well, they really didn't. Women and girls were not allowed into gymnasiums or encouraged to exercise. Plato did write about women exercising, but it was kind of an idealization. It wasn't really the reality for women and girls. If you dial back several centuries to, let's say, the 10th century BC and a kind of military state, Sparta, that was a rare exception. Sparta was a kind of military state where women and girls were also encouraged to exercise. If you think of exercise as kind of fitness training for war.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I say in the book, one could argue that exercise as we know it today really did begin as kind of training for war, for hand-to-hand combat. So women and girls did train alongside men. And then there were the Olympic Games, which were founded in the 8th century. And there was a kind of trickle-down effect as the popularity of all those athletic competitions flourished, and exercise kind of trickled down to the masses, at least the men and boys, and became part of the culture of ancient Greece and Rome. But one of the challenges of writing this book was finding when did women really enter the picture?
Mm.
And that was something I was always kind of on the lookout for. And any women who were pioneers in that area, it was fun and challenging to find out about them.
Did you find one perfect exercise and one exercise that it was unanimous to avoid?
Well, one perfect exercise. I mean, one exercise that definitely comes up commonly, whether from Hippocrates or Plato or Mercuriality, is walking.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what many doctors and others would recommend today. What I tell people is think of exercise as synonymous with movement. So if you can get in a walk every day or every other day, the best you can do, that is a great form of exercise. Doesn't have to be anything special up a beautiful mountain trail or whatever like that. If you don't have time, just get off your bus 2 or 3 stops early, or your subway 2 or 3 stops early, and walk the rest of the way home. And that's your exercise for the day. So there was also a belief in moderation. It was Plato who really advocated for moderation in exercise. And I suspect, he doesn't say this, but I suspect that Plato, as a former athletic competitor, wrestler, knew something about injuries and over-exercising. So he was an advocate for moderation. And he, Aristotle, Hippocrates, all recommended walking. For myself personally, yes, walking. I walk a lot in New York and I love to take walks, but I also love swimming. I'm a swimmer, and I learned to swim as a kid and I love to swim, but really my own love of swimming came with my relationship with my late partner, Oliver Sacks, who was a great swimmer. And let's see, you also asked about exercise to avoid.
Yeah, if there is one.
Well,
I guess
yes.
archery.
I say that I told you that the book is also kind of chronicle of my own history of exercise. So I write about almost every form of exercise that I tried or attempted over the course of writing this book. And one very memorable experience was going through a 6-week intensive boxing boot camp, which was not just kind of cardio kickboxing, but was really serious boxing, which I had never done before. And it was very intense. 6 days a week for 6 weeks, up at 6 a.m. for 90 minutes, and intensive cardio and training and calisthenics, but also in the ring, actually sparring with partners. And that was pretty scary, to be honest.
Better back to the pool.
Yeah. And Mercuriality takes this on himself. As I said, every chapter is devoted to a different form. And he examines boxing and wonders if there are any benefits to boxing, but ultimately comes out saying it's not too safe.
Not too safe.
Yeah.
Did you find anything about the origins of running?
Yeah, of course. Running, you have to go back many, many years, millions of years to, go ahead.
No, I'm surprised at that.
Well, I'm thinking of when did running evolve in our species? That's really what I was going to. We became bipedal as hominids millions of years ago, but eventually came to be able to run at fast speeds and at great distances, and to be able to run marathon races, which is unlike other primates or animals that are bipedal. Of course, there are other animals besides human beings that are bipedal, whether primates or the ostrich. But human beings are especially gifted and able to run at great distances, at high speeds. And that was an evolutionary adaptation, undoubtedly due to purely, life or death circumstances, a survival adaptation, most likely due to changes in the climate, changes in the environment, changes in the diet that made running something that was advantageous in going after animals, going after food, hunting down what was called persistence hunting or endurance running, really running animals till they died before you did, so they could be your dinner, or running away from warring tribes. So running, wasn't something that just evolved simply because early hominids got tired of walking and wanted to just go for a jog. It was it was very much a survival adaptation, and we evolved anatomically to become equipped anatomically to run with a head that doesn't flop too much when we run, with lungs that breathe efficiently, with muscles, whether gluteus muscles or calf muscles, that are perfectly designed for running. So the whole human body evolved to become very specialized in running in a way that other animals and primates just aren't.
Run or run to or run away, I guess.
Run to or run away.
Since the title of your book is Sweat, do you want to tell people what that is actually a function for? Because I think most people are not 100% sure why we do sweat.
I think there are a lot of misconceptions about sweat and sweating. We so often hear today that one wants to sweat out the toxins, whether by doing a spin class or Peloton or a hot yoga class. That whole idea of sweating out toxins or detoxing by sweating, that's kind of exaggerating. We have other organs in the body that really function to filter out toxins and waste, namely the kidney and the liver. The main purpose of sweating is thermoregulation, to cool down the body. And it's really an incredibly ingenious, pretty simple evolutionary adaptation. These millions of pores on the skin through which this watery, salty fluid comes, and there's evaporative cooling. It's just as simple as that. So really, when you sweat, some people immediately want to sop it off or stop it, or they're embarrassed by it, but it means that your body is overheating, and it's a good thing. Really, when it all comes down to it, sweating keeps you from dying. It keeps you alive. But I was interested to learn that there are different kinds of sweating. There's the sweating that's thermoregulation, which is the main kind of sweating. But there's also something called emotional sweating. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You sweat out of when you're afraid, even stage fright.
Yeah.
Like I certainly had that early in my career doing speaking engagements, and I would like break out into a total sweat. That's emotional sweating. Babies, when they're born, I was amazed by this. When babies are born, they're born with as many pores as we have throughout our lives, as I have today. And so a baby in the first minutes of its life may break out into a sweat, and you can see that. And that is a kind of emotional sweating. When a baby cries, it may sweat, but emotional sweating is confined to only certain parts of the body, primarily the forehead, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet. Whereas the thermoregulation, the cooling part of sweating, is the entire body.
Wow.
And then there is a second sort of category of sweating, a different kind of sweat gland called apocrine, which is the sweating that is more funky smelling, I'll put it that way, in the armpits and other areas. But that was also an evolutionary adaptation. As a way to sort of communicate through smell, as well as sight, different states of being, whether fear or whatever. So it's a very simple function of the human body, but definitely serves a very important purpose.
Yeah, more complicated than it looks.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, from sweating, let's go to something a little bit more breezy, the bicycle. Talk about the bicycle and what it did for us as a population and how it fits into the history of exercise.
Yeah, that was really fun to look into, because I think we just take bicycles for granted in almost every major city. You know, we have city bike and things like that, and we've biked since we were kids. Some people thought that Leonardo da Vinci was the first to design a bicycle, but that turns out to be a complete myth. The bicycle was invented in the 19th century, but it wasn't just an overnight thing. It took about 75 years for the bicycle as we know it today to be refined and perfected. And the bicycle in its most primitive form started as a kind of substitute for horses, because there was a drought in the early 19th century and a shortage of horses. And so these very simple machines were created with wheels, but no pedals. And so you sort of scooted forward just with your feet. And then the bicycle went through lots of different variations. Pedals were introduced, and then the wheels changed to, very large wheels in the front, small wheel in the back. These bicycles that almost seem to require a ladder to get onto. And then finally in the 1890s, there was an invention of what was called the safety bicycle, where finally the two wheels were the same size. And it was pretty much close to the bicycle we know today. And someone, hopefully it was a woman, I never did quite track it down, someone had the brilliant idea to remove the horizontal bar between the seat and the handlebar so that women could more easily mount a bicycle in their long skirts and dresses. We're talking really the Victorian era. And there was introduced what was called a ladies' safety bicycle. And one of my favorite quotes in the whole book comes from Susan B. Anthony, the women's rights activist and suffragette, who said, "The bicycle has done more for the emancipation of women than just about anything else in the world." She said, "I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood." So women, this is a period where women were being encouraged to exercise for lots of reasons. And the bicycle came on the scene not only as a form of transportation to get from here to there, but as recreation and as exercise. But that the 19th century is a really interesting moment because women are finally encouraged and permitted to exercise alongside men and boys.
Yeah, even though with a lot of clothes on.
Yeah, even though a lot of clothes on. Yeah.
When you see people who were women who were hiking in that era, you wonder how they all didn't just die going up a mountain because they had so many clothes on and such bad shoes. But I guess we've adjusted, we've adapted.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about rest in exercise, because you touched on it earlier with injury.
Yeah.
And what part does it play? And it must be important, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a real danger in over exercising too much.
Yeah.
It's important to give the body time to rest, repair muscles, and I think mentally as well, to come back to exercise with a new motivation. But yeah, certainly rest is important in just sort of letting the body repair and rest. So I'm very much, as was Plato, very much an advocate for taking breaks from exercising, not intensively exercising every day, that realizing your body needs, and I'm not just talking about sleep, but really a break from exercising.
Yeah.
And I've certainly gone through periods of not exercising much at all, and come back to it and appreciated it and enjoyed it more after periods of not exercising.
Just need a refresh.
Yeah, yeah.
You speak in the book about bumping into Alice Waters, and also talking to Ruth Bader Ginsburg about her exercise regime. Would you share that with the audience? Both interesting ladies.
Yeah, Alice Waters is the famous founder, chef of Chez Panisse, the restaurant in Berkeley, California. And I had a fellowship in Rome. You know, I talked earlier about Mercuriality and how I wanted to retrace his footsteps. He wrote De Arte Gymnastica in Rome when he was personal physician to Farnese. So I spent a couple of trips in Rome and fellowships at the American Academy in Rome. And on one of those trips, bumped into Alice Waters. And she asked me what I was working on. And I told her my subject, the history of exercise. And she was very taken aback and kind of bothered because she thought of exercise, as many people do, as a purely modern construct, a purely modern phenomenon, a purely modern obsession. And I remember her saying that gyms are the fast food of exercise. So a very kind of disdainful view of exercise and of people obsessed with exercise. But we had a great discussion because in her view, I guess the same phrase, exercise should be synonymous with movement, and it should just be worked naturally, intuitively, organically into your daily life. And for her, as a restaurant founder, working in a restaurant every day, she said, you know, I carry boxes up and down the stairs from the basement many times a day. I sweep the porch. I'm constantly moving throughout the day, using every part of my body. And that in itself is exercise. There's no reason to go to a gym, to separate it out and make it what she called work. You know, exercise should be pleasurable. And, you know, another form of exercise we haven't talked about is dancing. You know, she loves to dance. And that's a very legitimate form of exercise, one that Mercuriality also definitely endorsed. So, you know, she felt like exercise should be pleasurable, which I agree with very much as well. That it shouldn't be something you consider work or agonize over or dread and want to get over. It just should just be part of your daily life. I was also lucky enough in a completely different context to meet Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the late Supreme Court Justice. And she too asked me what I was working on. I was almost embarrassed because here I am with this great mind, this great justice, someone I really looked up to. But I told her, and she was very interested. And I asked her about her own exercise routine. She was, I think, 81 at the time. And she sort of said the opposite of Alice Waters. You know, she said, exercise has saved my life. My trainer, her personal fitness trainer, she said had really helped save her life after a cancer diagnosis, and put her through a pretty rigorous exercise regimen, including cardio and free weights and stretches. But what most impressed me, she told me that he taught her how to do a push-up. And a push-up is a very simple body weight exercise, but also not easy to do. And she told me that she did 20 push-ups every day. And I was impressed for two reasons. First of all, to do 20 push-ups every day, whether you're 81 or 21, is in itself remarkable. But also that a woman of 81 was able to do that. It's anatomically just a little more challenging usually, but not always, for women to do push-ups because it's very much an upper body exercise. But she explained in careful detail how she kind of progressed, learning how to do a military style push-up, starting just by doing it against a wall and getting her technique right. I'm sure she was very disciplined. And then going down to doing it on her knees and doing a few on her knees, eventually doing a full military like plank style push-up, a classic push-up, only able to do one for a while, but then adding a second. And after doing two, adding a third, and just working up to the point where she could do 20 every day. And I just thought that was such a great story.
Yeah.
And when I said goodnight, I said, I'm going to go home and do 20 push-ups. And she said, you're young, you can do a lot more than that. So she sort of challenged me to do 4 times that many.
I love how she tells you to start with 1 and then go to 2 and then go to 3, which is what everyone should do when they're starting new exercise. And instead we say, oh, I'm going to do 50, and then you run into a wall and you say, tomorrow I won't do any.
Yeah,
so
and then
great
and then
advice.
Yeah, and then maybe you give up. I mean, you really can start with 1 push-up and then go to 2.
Interesting, ladies. We're getting close to the, well, not that close to the end of the hour, but let's talk about United States yoga, type of yoga, and the Indian type of yoga, since you experienced both of them.
Yeah, I was able to write a little bit about yoga. I've practiced yoga, I guess, over the last 15 years or so. Yoga, it's a little bit tricky to find the exact origins of yoga and the specific inventors, if you will, of yoga, but it goes back about 5,000 years, originated in northern India, for a long time associated very closely with spiritual practice. I was part of yoga from the very beginning. Evolved in practice over the years, different branches of yoga with different masters creating different kinds of yoga. But it really changes in the 19th century. Again, such a key century in the history of exercise, when yoga masters or yogi traveled to the West and began traveling, lecturing, demonstrating, teaching yoga techniques, publishing books in English. And there was a kind of craze in the 19th century for this unusual form of exercise, yoga, that wasn't necessarily related to spiritual practice, but just
Mhm.
to movement. And one thing we haven't really talked about is, why the 19th century? There are lots of reasons. One of them, maybe the most obvious, is exercise as a kind of reaction to the Industrial Revolution and a concern, a global concern, that people were becoming too sedentary, going, to put it simplistically, from the farm to the factory,
Yeah.
sitting all day. And so there was this global movement that came to be called physical culture, getting people out and moving. And for the first time, again, not only men, but women and girls. And yoga sort of gets swept up in that. And that this is a period too when there was a new emphasis on exercise for children and the introduction for the first time of PE classes, physical education classes. And a great deal of this comes from Northern Europe, from innovators like Per Henrik Ling, who was an early 19th century innovator of calisthenics, I guess is the best word, and of what really would be group fitness classes that he originated. And he very specifically encouraged and trained women as well as men. And one of Per Henrik Ling's contributions was to create a university that was really the first university devoted to exercise science, and training teachers who would then bring the Ling method around the world, which indeed they did. Ling graduates went to England and also to America and influenced people like Catherine Beecher, who was the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I say in the book that Catherine Beecher was sort of like the Jane Fonda of the 19th century, in that she traveled, lectured, demonstrated, encouraged women to exercise, which was groundbreaking at the time. And to work exercise, sort of like Alice Waters was saying, into their daily lives, into their lives as mothers and wives, and while doing housework and domestic chores. It's really about, and one could say this today about exercise, it's really about intention. It's about thinking of this movement as exercise, not just as transportation. So going back to that example of getting off the bus 3 stops early and thinking, I'm not just trudging home, but I'm actually getting some exercise and finding some enjoyment in it and focusing on it in an intentional way.
Interesting, the parallel between the Industrial Revolution and our technological revolution, that, we're in the same boat. People are sitting at desks too long and staring at screens too long, and maybe we'll have another resurgence in exercise. I guess we do. I guess Peloton took over last year and the year before, but
yeah, although Peloton recently completely collapsed, interestingly enough.
But not before they sold a bunch.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, well, the whole fitness industry, as we know of it today, really exploded in the 1970s. And
yeah, well, let me, before we go to the 70s, would you briefly speak about Jack LaLanne and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and what did they do for the world of exercise that you could share with us?
Well, I think Jack LaLanne in particular brilliantly exploited the new medium of television. He wasn't alone. There were others who did, and there were women as well. But Jack LaLanne is probably the most famous. He had a TV series that was at first local and then became national. I remember Jack LaLanne's show. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Going back and looking at those shows, what's so impressive, again, is how sensible his workouts were. And he had a TV program where he would take people viewers through a pretty simple exercise routine that was sensible, started with a warm-up, got a little more, energy, got the heart rate going, got the breathing going, got you sweating, and then did a cool down. He happened to be very charismatic and handsome. He wore this signature jumpsuit,
Yeah.
and he was kind of a strong man, did kind of strongman feats. He was around for a long time.
Didn't he pull a giant ship
Yeah.
in San Francisco Bay?
Yeah, something like that, a barge or something like that.
Something
Yeah.
like that. Because wasn't he not Mr. America, but wasn't he one of the first titled men bodybuilders?
He may have been, and
Yeah.
that's, that leads to talking about Schwarzenegger. There was already a subculture of bodybuilding and bodybuilding competitions, but Schwarzenegger was definitely the breakout star, someone with movie star charisma, as we all would later learn. But that really brought bodybuilding and weightlifting into a whole new light, and sort of changed an ideal of the masculine body to be more muscular. I mean, hypermuscular, hypertrophied bodies. But there's a way in which you might sort of look back on that and make fun of it and find it ridiculous. But honest to God, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, which I got when I was probably 16, still to this day is a great guide to weightlifting alone, not even just bodybuilding. So Schwarzenegger and Jack LaLanne and Jane Fonda were very important figures in the whole history of exercise.
Yeah, talk a little bit about Jane before we get to the end of our hour.
Jane Fonda, who I'm proud to say gave a great blurb for Sweat. I think she is one of the most important figures in the history of exercise for men and women alike, but particularly for women. In the early 1980s, she, through her videotapes, her workout tapes, democratized exercise, made it possible for women all around the world to do Jane, as it was called, do a workout at home, pop in a videotape, which at the time was a whole new technology. And women didn't have to join gyms, or people didn't have to join gyms, didn't have to hire a babysitter, could wear whatever they want. They could do it when they could do it, whether in the morning or late at night. But, and I grew up in that era, so I remember Jane Fonda. I remember going to aerobics classes and wearing those clothes. And I think when it came to that part of my research, I approached it with a certain skepticism, thinking, was that all just really campy and silly? But I was really impressed. I mean, the workouts themselves are great. I mean, you could do those workouts during the pandemic. Yeah. You can find them online. They're great. And most importantly, Jane Fonda was a really, really good, gifted instructor. Articulate, encouraging, fun, really articulate, like the best kind of yoga teacher about exactly what movement you should be doing. And she made it fun. There was music in the videotapes. She's working out with a group of people. It was amazingly diverse group of people, men and women, Black, brown, white. It was really, she was really ahead of her time, and helped make exercise become a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and fun.
And fun.
We didn't talk about Title IX. Would you just speak to that a little bit?
Title IX is important for women and girls, passed in 1972. And sort of, there's a kind of misconception that it was a sports equity amendment to the civil rights law, which is partly true, but not wholly true. Title IX ended discrimination on the basis of sex for publicly funded educational programs of any kind, meaning anything from athletics to science to technology. But what it is best known for, and deservedly so, was funneling funding into athletic programs and sports programs for girls and young women in grade school, high school, college, and making it equal to those for boys and young men, so that for the first time, really, girls and young women could pursue just about any sport they wanted, whether basketball or baseball or hockey, not just ballet or gymnastics or figure skating. Not that those aren't great sports or great forms of exercise, but just leveled the playing field, not only culturally, but also financially, frankly. And also helped break stereotypes about what used to be called, quote unquote, the weaker sex, proving, as we see every day, as we see on the Olympics on TV tonight, that women are as great of athletes as men in any sport you could pick.
Yeah.
So Title IX was incredibly important, incredibly
Nice.
important.
I have a question coming in from Jeffrey. Some get endorphins from exercising. Why do some not get them?
That's a good question. Why do some not get them?
Or what? Maybe explain what they are first to people who don't.
Well, endorphins is kind of the body's evolutionary reward for exercising, a kind of neurochemical that's produced by the brain when you exercise at a high intensity for a certain period. That gives you a sense of physical as well as mental well-being. It's really like a natural high in a way. Maybe some people feel it more than other people. I don't know if some people have higher levels than others. It may depend on how much you exercise. I know for myself that it can be, that I can certainly feel that kind of rush, which is also paradoxically a feeling of calm, when I do very intensive exercise, like swimming really hard for a mile. I'm not really a runner anymore, but I used to definitely get that with running or like even bicycling on a stationary bike.
Yeah.
But it's definitely an evolutionary adaptation, a way that the body encourages you to move at high speeds.
We have another member of the audience who wanted to say, was asking, did you mention Tai Chi in your book? And he probably Qigong as well.
I didn't. One of the big challenges for me of this book was just figuring out what I could write about and, just containing it all. So Sweat is not meant to be absolutely comprehensive, covering every form of exercise around the world. It is primarily about the Western world and what were originally Western forms of exercise or sport. So I don't go into Tai Chi. I will leave that to another author.
Do you think that exercise should continue your whole life from what you've researched?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One should always move. In my own life, the best example was my late partner, Oliver Sacks, who loved to swim, loved to work out, loved to take walks, and did so up until weeks before he died. Even when he couldn't get to the pool or get to the gym, would make it a point to stride up and down the corridor, or even when he was confined to bed, just to move in bed. When people ask me about what motivates you to exercise, I say, it's sort of the opposite of your question. Even though there is indisputable scientific evidence that exercise can help you live longer and make you healthier and prevent illness, don't exercise only because you think it will help you live longer, because you never know and life is short. Exercise for how it makes you feel now, in your body, about your life. Exercise for how it makes you feel now, but and do that for as long as you're alive.
Yeah, that's great advice. All right. Well, before we close the evening, what's next for you?
What's next for me? Good question. You know, this book took me a long time to write. It's great to have it out. It's my 7th book, and I'm also a photographer. This book does have some really cool, beautiful historical photographs in it. They're not my own, but I have published books with my photography in it. And street photography, which was part of my memoir, Insomniac City. Anyway, I think my next book will be a volume of my photography, but portraiture, not my street photography. That's my plan. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, this has been a totally interesting evening, and I hope none of us are sitting on a couch right now. We're going to be out, standing up, sitting down, and I'd like to show everyone the beautiful cover. And as I said, Barrett Bookstore has copies of this and probably copies of Bill's other books on hand. So stop by and get one. And it was a totally fascinating read, and so much I didn't know that I came away learning about. So thank you. And we will all be in the gym tomorrow morning, bright and early.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and good night. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.